Finally, the connecting thread of all companion relationships, be it marriage or friendship, is conversation. Perhaps we rarely think of conversation in an academic sense, but our entire lives are woven from conversations. Charles Duhigg, in his book, Supercommunicators, How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection, chose a very different lens to observe something seemingly ordinary. Instead of viewing communication merely as a skill for conveying information, he saw it as a complex network of neurological alignment, of micro-choices in every glance, every sigh, every question asked at just the right moment. The book poses a thought-provoking paradox. Why do we sometimes click with someone instantly, while at other times, no matter how hard we try, every word falls into an empty space? Why do we sometimes long to be understood, but choose to respond with cold logic, when what the other person truly needs is empathy? And most importantly, can we learn to become a supercommunicator, someone capable of opening deep channels of connection in any dialogue, or is this merely an innate ability of a select few? I invite you to delve into this book not to find rigid formulas, but to discover a secret. Communication, at its most subtle level, is not the art of speaking or listening, but the art of building trust and presence between two people. Now, let's begin with the summary of this book. Part 1, The 3 Types of Conversations. Conversation is the shared air we breathe every day. We converse with family, friends, colleagues, strangers, and even pets. We type, text, email, post online, sometimes write letters. Sometimes it's just a sigh or a frown, but not all conversations carry the same weight. There are times we walk away from a dialogue feeling enlightened, as if we've touched a profound level of connection. And there are times we leave with annoyance and frustration, unsure if the other person understood what we said or if we truly heard what they meant. Where does the difference lie? Why do some conversations bring us closer, while others only push us apart? Humans are wired to crave connection. Over thousands of years of evolution, the ability to bond and align with others has been key to our survival. But achieving that alignment isn't simple. It requires understanding that many types of conversations coexist, and most importantly, to connect, we need to speak the same language with the other person at the same time and on the same wavelength. Those we call supercommunicators aren't born different. They simply think more deeply about the mechanics of conversation, why some succeed, why some fail, and the myriad small moments in dialogue that can draw people together or drive them apart. They learn to identify and seize those moments. The story begins with a seemingly ordinary man, Jim Lehrer. In the early 1980s, he joined the CIA. His academic record was unremarkable: no foreign languages, no military service, no special skills. Just one thing: in his final interview, when asked why he wanted to be a spy, he confessed, "My life feels empty. I want to be part of something meaningful." That honesty earned him a chance at the secret training camp. They taught him many skills: lock-picking, surveillance, dead drops, cryptography. But the most surprising revelation was that the core of being a spy wasn't daring actions, but communication. The real job of an intelligence officer wasn't to hide in the shadows, but to converse. They had to mingle at cocktail parties, befriend diplomats, connect with officials, communicating to the point that training materials explicitly stated. The goal is to make the target believe the agent is the only person who truly understands them. Lehrer went into the field with enthusiasm, but his efforts repeatedly failed. A wealthy Chinese official didn't need money. A receptionist turned out to be a KGB trap. All of this left him almost desperate. Then came Jasmine, a young woman from the Middle East working for her country's foreign ministry, on leave in Europe. When they met, she complained about the harshness of the new regime, the oppression of women, the loss of freedom. Lehrer sensed an opportunity. He suggested she cooperate. When he frankly revealed his true identity, Jasmine panicked, burst into tears, and fled. He failed miserably. But at their last dinner, before she returned home with nothing left to lose, Lehrer abandoned all his tricks. Instead of persuading, he told her about himself: his fear of not being good enough, his clumsiness in his approaches, the shame of almost being trapped by the KGB, his feelings of failure and emptiness. He spoke of his own despair, similar to her despair for her homeland's future. And strangely, it was this honest vulnerability that opened a door. Jasmine cried, then changed her mind. She said, "I want to do something meaningful." She became a vital source for decades. To connect, you must match the other person, not by mimicking gestures or speaking mechanically, but by hitting the right type of conversation they are having. If they are in an emotional space, show you are also emotional. If they are thinking practically, follow their practical logic. If they are concerned about social identity, approach it from that angle. Scientists have sought to explain why such moments of alignment occur. A study at Princeton showed that when one person recounted a long story about their high school prom, listeners who paid close attention had brain activity synchronized with the storyteller's brain. The more synchronized, the more details they remembered and the deeper their understanding. This neuroalignment is the biological foundation of connection. Dr. Sivers, a researcher at DM, was once a musician. He was familiar with the strange feeling during an improvisational performance when the entire band, audience, and technicians seemed to merge into one rhythm. Later, he brought that question into the lab: why do people sometimes click so easily? Sivers and his colleagues showed volunteers short, confusing film clips without subtitles or sound. Initially, each person reacted differently. Then, they were divided into small groups to discuss and reach some conclusions. When shown the clips again in a brain scanner, these groups began to have synchronized neural activity. Their brains seemed to be thinking along the same lines, but what was more interesting was that not all groups synchronized equally strongly. In groups with one or two special individuals, the level of alignment was significantly higher. Not because these individuals were overbearing leaders, but because they played a central, nucleus role. This central person usually spoke less but asked 10 or 20 times more questions than others. They repeated others' ideas to clarify. They were quick to laugh at themselves, and they rapidly adjusted their tone to fit the mood. When the conversation was serious, they were serious. When the atmosphere was light, they encouraged more comfort. They encouraged others to speak up, and somehow, they made everyone feel easy to connect. Their influence was almost invisible yet decisive. When they suggested a viewpoint, the group often leaned towards it, without the members themselves realizing how much they had been guided. After the experiments, when asked, many people thought the group reached consensus naturally, unaware that the agreement actually revolved around the central person. Outside the lab, such people have more friends, are often elected to leadership positions, and are frequently sought out for advice. In other words, they are supercommunicators. Research shows the secret lies not in imposing, but in the ability to match, to adjust oneself to align with others. This is the core of the matching principle. To understand this deeper, we need to look at the three mental states the brain operates in during conversation. First, there's the asterisk decision-making state ***, often appearing when we discuss practical matters. What are we really talking about here? From practical choices to action plans. This is when the executive control network in the prefrontal cortex is active, helping us analyze, weigh, and compare. Second, there's the asterisk emotional state ***, prominent when we ask, how are we feeling here? The amygdala, memory regions, and the brain's reward system engage when recounting a happy memory, a pain, or simply needing empathy instead of solutions. We are in this state. Finally, there's the asterisk social state ***, linked to the question, who are we? At that moment, the brain activates the default mode network, which processes identity, status, and social relationships. When we chat about the office, family, religion, or background, we are conversing in this state. Research indicates that 70% of everyday conversations are social in nature. All three states often intertwine in a dialogue. A friend might start by discussing work, then shift to complaining about being tired, and then worry about how colleagues perceive them. If two people aren't on the same wavelength at the same time, misalignments occur. A classic example, you complain, "My boss drives me crazy." If the other person immediately says, "Why don't you ask him to lunch?" You'll feel dismissed. You need emotional connection, while the other person offers a decision. Conflict arises from this difference in conversation type. Supercommunicators know how to synchronize. If the other person is in an emotional state, they also share emotions. If the other person wants to solve a problem, they analyze it together. If the other person is concerned about their image, they discuss roles and status. The matching principle emphasizes that effective communication isn't about superficially imitating the other person, not just nodding, smiling along, or repeating their words. Matching requires genuine understanding what conversational layer the other person is on, what they need from us, and then expressing ourselves at a corresponding level. Only then can trust and connection form. Lara's story with Jasmine illustrates this. When he tried to persuade her with logic and benefits, he failed. When he opened up about his own vulnerability and confusion, Jasmine felt safe because she realized he wasn't just someone looking to exploit information. They were on the same emotional level: fear, insecurity, and a desire to do something meaningful. And it was at that common point that connection emerged. That is the power of the matching principle. If you want to enter someone's inner world, show them you are also willing to let them enter yours. Studies on marriage show that happy couples often maintain symmetry in their conversations. They mirror each other not in content but in emotion. If one is stressed, the other is serious. If one jokes, the other plays along. This harmony keeps them close. Gottman, the renowned psychologist, calls this symbiosis in communication. These moments can be very subtle: a well-timed question, a smile in a tense atmosphere, a synchronized sigh. But it is precisely these seemingly trivial details that can turn the tide of an entire conversation. To illustrate, consider an experiment in an investment banking environment, a place of fierce competition and frequent shouting. The research team asked each person before a meeting to write down one sentence: "What is my goal for this meeting?" Some shared what they wrote, others kept it to themselves. The results showed that simply performing this simple act reduced the level of conflict. The feeling of being listened to increased. Why? Because by defining their goal, each person was implicitly declaring the type of conversation they desired. That helped others adjust accordingly. This is the basis of 4 meaningful communication rules. The first rule: determine the type of conversation before speaking. If you want your partner just to listen, say so clearly. If you need a solution, let them know. And when conversing with others, observe their signals. What do they want from you? Empathy, a concrete plan, or an acknowledgement of their identity? Some schools apply this principle in a very simple way. When a child approaches a teacher in distress, the teacher asks, "Do you want help, a hug, or just to be listened to?" 3 small choices, but each corresponds to a type of conversation. The question helps the child identify their need and helps the teacher adjust their response. The common thread in all these examples: a meaningful conversation only happens when both parties enter a learning conversation, a conversation where you genuinely want to understand the other person and are willing to let them understand you. It's not just about exchanging information, but about learning to see the world through each other's eyes at a deeper level. A learning conversation demands that we drop our defenses. It calls us to share our vulnerabilities, to ask questions instead of making assertions, to listen to what hasn't been said. We don't need to pretend to be smart or strong. We just need to be honest about our experiences, feelings, and perspectives. When we do that, others often respond by revealing themselves, and connection emerges. When we look closely at what happens in the brain during conversation, we see that the 3 layers of conversation don't operate separately but shift continuously. Someone might start by asking, "What should we do about our child's grades?" Then move to, "I'm worried I'm failing as a parent." And finally, "What will others think of our family?" Each transition activates different neural networks in the brain. If the other person doesn't keep up, both will feel disconnected, like speaking 2 foreign languages. The most common mistake in communication is this misalignment. One person vents frustration, the other offers solutions. One person wants to discuss social status, the other focuses on analyzing data. Disagreement doesn't necessarily stem from content, but from each party living in a different type of conversation. Supercommunicators are acutely aware of this. They observe to detect signals: someone's eyes dropping, a voice catching, a forced laugh. All these suggest what the other person wants. And once they identify it, they match, not to pretend, but to create genuine synchronization. Once both are on the same level, the conversation flows and trust emerges. The matching principle thus becomes the central rule. To connect, identify the type of conversation and harmonize with it. When the other person is stressed and emotional, allow yourself to be emotional too. When they want to make a decision, discuss logic together. When they are worried about social perception, discuss identity and relationships. But remember, matching is not blind submission. It doesn't mean agreeing with everything. It demands sincerity, sharing how you truly feel, while also demonstrating that you hear and understand the other person's feelings and needs. To see this in action, let's return to Lara. His failure didn't come from a lack of persuasive skill, but from his inability to match Jasmine. When she confided her insecurities, he offered logical solutions and promises. Only when he dropped his mask and admitted his own insecurities did the conversation change. Jasmine saw a genuine empathy in him, and from that, trust arose. This transformed him from a clumsy operative into one of the CIA's most successful recruiters. Later, this skill was incorporated directly into training materials. Agents must start as acquaintances, then friends, then confidants, and finally, partners in cooperation. This entire process can only happen when they know how to match the other person through each type of conversation. This principle isn't just for secret missions, it appears everywhere: family, workplace, friendships. And it reminds us that every conversation is a series of small choices: a well-timed question, an admission of vulnerability, a soft laugh. All can change the outcome. The 4 rules for a meaningful conversation begin here. First, ask yourself, what is my purpose in speaking? This seemingly simple question is very powerful because if you're not clear about what type of conversation you're seeking, the chances of you and the other person diverging are very high. The second rule is to observe signals and ask questions. Does the other person seem to want a vent, or do they need a concrete decision? Are they worried about what others think, or do they actually need an action plan? Skillful questions will help identify this. The third rule is to share yourself, both strengths and weaknesses. What made Jasmine open up wasn't promises, but Lara's admission of his own clumsiness. Similarly, when we dare to express our truth, others will feel permitted to do the same. Finally, the rule is to turn dialogue into a learning conversation. This is a state where the goal isn't just to persuade or win, but to understand how others see the world and help them understand how we see it. When both enter a conversation with a learning mindset, the connection becomes much stronger. There are very small situations that clearly illustrate turning a conversation into a learning conversation. Like in the experiment at the financial company, when employees were asked to write one sentence about their goal before the meeting, the atmosphere changed dramatically. People still debated, still disagreed, but the feeling of being sidelined decreased. Why? Because everyone had implicitly revealed, what do I want this conversation to be about? What type of conversation am I looking for? This simple act helped them listen to each other more clearly. In daily life, we can do something similar before an important conversation. Stop for a few seconds to ask yourself, what do I want from this conversation? What do I hope will happen? And when listening to others, subtly notice what signals they are sending. Is it a desire for empathy, a need for a solution, or an obsession with social status? A familiar example is the question some schools encourage teachers to ask students: do you want help, a hug, or to be listened to? A small but magical question, because it forces the child to pause and distinguish their real need. And when the child answers, the teacher knows what type of conversation they need to match. This creates a safe space where emotions are named and handled appropriately. Everyday conversations with friends and family are often more natural because we are familiar with them and can guess what they need. But in important dialogues, when conflict is latent, actively identifying and matching the conversation type becomes a decisive factor. Otherwise, we easily fall into a situation where everyone is going in a different direction, like 2 people rowing upstream. The essence of a learning conversation is a genuine desire to understand each other. It requires us to pay more attention, listen more, and express things usually hidden. Sometimes just an open-ended question like, do you want me to give you a solution or just listen? Or, does this make you anxious about what others might think? These questions open the door for the other person to express themselves, and from there, we can both enter the same conversational layer. Looking back at the entire journey from the beginning, we see a red thread running through it all. Connection starts from the matching principle, from Lara and Jasmine, from musicians who felt each other, from synchronized brain experiments to happy couples. All demonstrate one thing: to communicate effectively, first, match the person opposite you. And when you match, the conversation is not just words or sounds, it becomes a bridge. In that moment, we not only understand each other better, but also feel we are participating in something larger than ourselves. The first part concludes with 4 simple but fundamental rules. 1. Know what your purpose is in speaking. 2. Observe, ask, and recognize the other person's type of conversation. 3. Share your true self. 4. Turn dialogue into a learning conversation, where both learn to see through each other's eyes. That is the foundation of supercommunication. From here, the journey will move to specific types of conversations to see how they operate and how we can match their rhythm. Part 2. What is the conversation really about? Every conversation, no matter how trivial, contains a silent negotiation that we may not realize. But when 2 people begin to speak, there's often a foundational moment. What are we really talking about, and where are we going? Without this moment, we walk away from the conversation feeling lost, as if 2 wanderers spoke past each other without ever meeting. This is when the "what are we really talking about here?" conversation type emerges. It has 2 goals. First, to clarify the actual topic needing discussion. Second, to establish the unspoken rules. How will we decide? What standards will we follow, and in what direction will the conversation flow? It often appears at the very beginning but can also erupt midway, especially when people argue about decisions, plans, costs, or benefits. And at that moment, a silent negotiation takes place. This negotiation isn't about someone winning, but about everyone clearly understanding what they want, so that they can then create something meaningful. If it doesn't happen, the result is confusion. You've surely left a discussion sighing, "We talked about nothing relevant," or "Everyone was talking to themselves, no one was listening." The solution lies in recognizing when the "what are we really talking about here?" conversation has begun, and then knowing how to negotiate its progression. The clearest illustration of this type of conversation takes place in a jury room in Wisconsin. It was a cold November in 1985. 12 people sat around a wooden table. They had nothing in common except living in the same state and being summoned by the court. Now they were a jury, responsible for deciding the fate of a man named Leroy Reed. Reed, 42, had a prior record for unintentionally being the getaway driver in a convenience store robbery. He was released early because it was believed he didn't even understand he had committed a crime. For 9 years, he lived peacefully, no fights, no reoffenses, no parole violations, a model neighbor in the Milwaukee ghetto. Then he was arrested for gun possession. With his prior record, that was illegal. Wisconsin law clearly states that felons cannot own firearms, and the penalty can be up to 10 years in prison. The evidence was irrefutable. He had bought the gun. Reed's lawyer admitted from the outset that there was no dispute. "My client is a former felon, and he had a gun." But he argued that Reed had limited intellectual capacity, reading only at a 2nd grade level, and could not understand that his actions were illegal. In court, a psychologist confirmed Reed's IQ was much lower than average. He recounted how Reed often couldn't distinguish between legal actions and crimes. The previous time, when driving for the robber, Reed thought his friend was just stopping to buy something. With such a person, could he be consciously convicted of a crime? Now, the 12 jurors had to deliberate, and in that closed room, a silent negotiation began. They weren't just discussing whether Reed was guilty or innocent, but also negotiating unspoken rules. When is naivete considered innocence? When can the law not be lenient? And how would they reach a collective decision? The jury room had 7 men and 5 women. Some were factory workers, others teachers. There was a firefighter, an accountant, and a stay-at-home mother. They arrived that morning, bringing their daily routines, and were suddenly thrust into the role of judging a man's fate. Before them were 2 stacks of papers, one with the judge's instructions, the other with verdict forms. The court guard pointed, "Here's the law, here's the form." A cold reminder that they now had to decide together. The initial discussion was quite straightforward. Many nodded. The evidence was clear. Reed owned a gun. The law states it clearly. So, guilty, but others hesitated. Brenda, a school psychologist, spoke up. "I wonder if there's a way to understand that he didn't really know he was committing a crime and didn't truly understand he possessed a weapon." Her words cast a pall over the room. The issue was no longer simply about possessing a gun, but whether the law could show leniency for limited intellect. Craig, the firefighter, reacted strongly. He didn't cause harm this time, but who knows about next time? That's why laws exist, to prevent bad things. Several others agreed, and the debate gradually heated up. This is the crux of the "what are we really talking about here?" conversation type. It doesn't just revolve around surface events, but delves into the meanings, values, and standards that the group implicitly agrees upon. No one wins by simply trying to impose their view. The important thing is to clarify what everyone truly wants. Bailey, one of the jurors, chose to ask questions instead of arguing. He didn't assert Reed's innocence or guilt, but asked others what they thought about the purpose of the law, about whether limited intellect should be considered. By asking, he subtly reshaped the conversation. Science calls this the process of silent negotiation. We often see it in international negotiations, in salary bargaining, but it actually happens even in the family kitchen. A couple discusses who will pick up the kids, who will cook dinner. At first glance, it's just about division, but underneath is negotiation. I want you to respect my time. I want you to acknowledge my work pressure. Researchers like Mitchell Jensen at Stanford call these skilled negotiators artists. They transform a conversation from a tug-of-war into a collective experiment. Instead of confrontation, they introduce new elements. We keep talking about salary, but why don't we discuss vacation days? Or, if I pick up the kids, how about you do the dishes? Each suggestion is a test to see the reaction, and from there to shape the path forward. Back in the jury room, Bailey understood that he couldn't force everyone to agree immediately. Instead, he tried to imagine himself in Reed's position and then asked, if you could only read a few words, would you truly understand you were breaking the law? If you never fully grasped the meaning of felon, would it be fair to punish you as a cunning person who intentionally committed a crime? The question didn't provide an immediate answer, but it opened a path, and that was the key point. The "what are we really talking about here?" Conversation succeeds when it transforms confrontation into cooperation, when everyone experiments together to find common values. The tension in the small room gradually lessened. Some jurors, after listening to Bailey, began to hesitate. They were no longer sure that simply sticking to the letter of the law was enough, but others retorted, the judge clearly stated the law doesn't allow ignorance as an excuse. The argument escalated, voices rose, hands slammed on the table. Bailey then changed tactics. He had asked, he had listened. Now he began the second thing, experimenting and adding a new element to the table. He proposed, if we imagine Reed as someone with normal understanding, would a 10-year sentence be reasonable? And if he truly couldn't understand, is there any other path besides conviction? By introducing a hypothetical situation, he expanded the discussion framework from just two options, guilty or not guilty. The conversation now had an added dimension, fairness and the meaning of punishment. Research shows that in many situations, when someone offers a new option, people start to see solutions not just as winning or losing. Salary negotiations can become deadlocked over a number, but if someone proposes additional vacation days or a remote work option, suddenly a way out appears. That's the nature of this type of conversation, not to eliminate conflict, but to transform it. Fisher, author of Getting to Yes, once wrote, "The challenge is not to eliminate conflict, but to transform it." In every conversation, from dividing household chores to court trials, when we add a new element to the table, we are inviting others to cooperate instead of forcing them to surrender. If you observe closely, you'll see yourself doing this every day without realizing it. When you make a joke to diffuse tension, when you suddenly become serious amid small talk, when you ask a deeper question about the underlying reasons. All are tests, aiming to see if the other person accepts the invitation to move in a new direction. That's when the conversation transforms into a shared experiment. Outwardly, it might just be an argument over who will grocery shop, who will pick up the kids. But inwardly, two people are asking, am I doing enough to help? Am I respecting your time? And through these questions, they negotiate to find common values. Back in the jury room, after many rounds of debate, the group began to listen to Bailey more. He didn't claim Reed was innocent. He simply kept reminding everyone to look at the true intention, at the defendant's capacity for understanding. Brenda, the psychologist, followed up. If we consider that he might not have understood he was breaking the law, then the verdict isn't just about right or wrong, but about fairness. The silent negotiation had now changed the atmosphere. They were no longer simply counting votes for guilty or not guilty, but delving deeper into the values of the law, into the goals that this entire system aimed to achieve. The deeper they went, the more people realized that this discussion wasn't solely about Reed. It reflected how humans negotiate in every context. What happened in that jury room was like a microcosm of life. Everyone brought in desires, fears, values, and all were forced to find common ground to move forward. Harvard research shows that preparing for a conversation makes it easier to enter this stage. In one experiment, participants simply spent 30 seconds writing down a few topics they wanted to discuss before talking. Often, those topics didn't even come up in the conversation, but the preparation itself made them more confident, led to fewer awkward silences, and afterwards, they felt more listened to. This suggests a principle. Before entering an important conversation, try asking yourself, what 2 topics could I bring up? What one thing do I really want to say? What question will I ask to understand the other person better? Just a few seconds of preparation can change the entire conversation. The second step in this art is knowing how to ask questions. In every, what are we really talking about here? Conversation, there's often a silent negotiation. Sometimes it happens quickly, like when someone says, "We need to discuss the weekend schedule," and you nod. That's it. But often it's more complex, requiring moving from pleasantries to simple matters before touching on what's truly intended: a cooperation proposal, an investment request, or a desire to change a relationship. Skilled communicators often use open-ended questions to prompt the other person to reveal what they truly care about. These could be questions about beliefs, evaluations, or experiences. The questions seem simple, but behind them is an invitation to reveal values and life perspectives. The third step is to observe signals during dialogue. Sometimes the important thing isn't in the answer, but in a glance, a hesitation, or a prolonged silence. These signals show what the other person is thinking more deeply about. Skilled communicators don't ignore these details. They pause, emphasize, or change their tone to match what's subtly unfolding. The fourth step is to experiment, to add new elements to the table. Just like in the jury room, when the possibility that Reed didn't consciously commit a crime was suggested, the conversation shifted. In a family, it might be when one person says, "If I cook, can you fold the laundry and do the dishes?" By adding choices, we open up new space for agreement. Returning to the jury, the initial atmosphere revolved solely around convicting or acquitting. But as questions and hypotheticals were introduced, the group began to see the issue from multiple angles. They realized they weren't just judging an individual, but also negotiating how society defines fairness and responsibility. Most importantly, the outcome of this silent negotiation wasn't just a verdict, but a feeling that everyone had been heard and that the final decision, whether strict or lenient, reflected a shared value. The silent negotiation inherent in every conversation never has a fixed formula. It's like a current, always changing based on how participants ask questions, add information, or create opportunities for each other. In the jury room, the change didn't come from grand speeches, but from someone daring to pause and ask, "What are we really talking about?" This is also true in everyday conversations. We might start simply to discuss who will buy groceries. But if we pay attention, we'll see we are simultaneously negotiating about respecting time, sharing work, and showing affection. And true connection comes when both recognize that deeper meaning. Some guidelines derived from this become useful tools. Prepare in advance. Just a few topics and questions will make the conversation easier. Use open-ended questions. They invite others to share values and beliefs rather than just information. Observe signals. Pauses, glances, changes in tone speak volumes. Be ready to experiment. Adding a new option can open up unexpected solutions. Finally, remember that the goal of this silent negotiation is not to win or lose. The goal is for everyone to feel heard, that what they value has been considered, and that the final decision reflects a common ground. If we skip the "what are we really talking about here" stage, the conversation will go astray. But if we identify and participate correctly, we can transform it into a learning conversation, where everyone not only exchanges but also learns and grows together. A silent but powerful negotiation where true values are revealed. From here, the journey will move to the next type of conversation. Conversations revolving around emotions, where the question is no longer, what are we talking about? But, how are we feeling? Part 3, how are we feeling? There's a truth about conversation that most of us know but often avoid. Real connection doesn't come from logic or facts, but from emotions. We can discuss, analyze, and make decisions, but if we don't touch emotions, the conversation remains a dry wall. To truly understand someone, we must dare to step into the question, how are we feeling? But that's much harder than imagined. Most people fear emotional conversations. We worry it will be awkward, too private, inappropriate at work, or will trigger a negative reaction. We fear we won't know what to say next if they cry, or if we ourselves cry. So we gloss over it, change the subject, leaving a silence that is never filled. Dr. Lee, a psychologist in Chicago, wanted to challenge that fear. He believed that people have the capacity for deep listening and connection, if only given the chance. But instead of trying with students or office workers, he chose a notoriously cool-headed group, hedge fund managers. These individuals were accustomed to calculating numbers, making dry decisions, and avoiding any display of emotion. Dr. Lee entered a room where dozens of hedge fund managers sat. They wore sharp suits, held phones, their eyes cautious. He spoke directly. Today, you will converse with a stranger, and in 10 minutes you will ask each other 3 questions. They chuckled, thinking it was a joke. But when he presented the third question, the room fell silent. The question was, can you tell me about a time you cried in front of someone else? One person blurted out, damn it, this is going to be terrible. And then the exercise began. Pairs sat opposite each other, asking and answering. Initially, it was awkward and clumsy, a few forced laughs. But after a few minutes, the atmosphere changed. Some spoke of losing a father, others of the fear of failure. Some confessed they had never cried in front of anyone, and that very fact made them feel empty. A miracle happened. These strangers suddenly felt close, their defenses gradually disappeared. They were no longer cold money managers, but human beings with pain, memories, and joy. Dr. Lee observed and smiled. He had proven that even in the most rigid environment, emotion is still the key to unlocking connection. After the exercise, many admitted it was the first time they had spoken so honestly with a colleague. Some said they would take the question home and try asking their spouse or children. Dr. Lee concluded, when you open up, others find it hard not to be drawn in. Emotion is contagious, and vulnerability itself builds trust. This reflects a very familiar moment in life. We're talking about weekend plans, then our friend sighs, I have some things to deal with, or a colleague mentions a family problem with a sad tone. That's the crossroads. We can ignore it, change the subject, or we can pause, ask more, and let the conversation shift to emotions. That small decision can change the entire relationship. The difficulty lies in the fact that when emotions arise, most of us avoid them. Sometimes we're afraid of making others uncomfortable. Sometimes we're afraid we ourselves will cry. But emotion is a language everyone understands, even when unspoken. A sigh, a hesitation, a choked voice-all are invitations to a deeper layer of dialogue. The author recounts a personal experience. When his father passed away, he told people he had just attended a funeral. Many responded with a brief, I'm sorry for your loss, then quickly changed the subject. Only a few asked more, what was your father like? Or, what do you remember most about him? And it was those questions that truly helped him feel understood and shared. Most people didn't ask, not because they were heartless, but because they didn't know how. They were afraid to touch something private or feared that if the answer was too sad, they wouldn't know how to react. This is a paradox. We crave to talk about the most emotional events in our lives, but others often don't dare to ask. The result is that the most important things are buried in silence. Science suggests a way out. Ask questions about beliefs, values, experiences that have changed the other person. Ask them how they feel. Instead of just asking for facts, encourage them to speak deeper. Then, share something from yourself. This doesn't make the conversation awkward, as we fear. On the contrary, it opens up a moment of authenticity. But sometimes emotions are not spoken, but only revealed through the body. A choked voice, a forced laugh, a frown. How do we hear these unnamed emotions? A story from television illustrates this clearly. In 2005, Bill Prady and Chuck Lorre came up with the idea of a group of clumsy geniuses who joked using mathematical humor and Klingon language. That was the initial sketch for a new sitcom. But as the writing team began to work, they realized that the decisive factor wasn't physics knowledge, but the ability to capture emotions in silence. In the writer's room, everyone not only exchanged lines, but also listened to each other's sighs, the time someone paused or their eyes wandered. These signals became the material for writing characters. That's why the show later not only made audiences laugh at nerdy jokes, but also made them feel the characters' loneliness, awkwardness, and yearning for love. It's a clear example. Emotions don't need to be spoken to exist. They are always there, in the silence, in the laughter, in the shrug. A good listener will recognize them, and from there, true connection forms. Another example comes from a bold social experiment centered on one of the most deeply divisive topics in America, gun ownership. The organizers set up an online discussion group, bringing together both supporters and opponents. The first 6 weeks were thorny, with heated arguments and harsh language. Many dropped out or were removed from the group. One person wrote, "I'm losing interest. No one wants to change their mind. See you at the ballot box." But some stayed. They began to discard empty slogans, instead telling personal stories. One person spoke of their fear after being attacked during a robbery. Another told of a loved one lost to gun violence. While sharing, they no longer tried to win arguments, but simply wanted to show the other person what they had lived through. It was in these moments that connection emerged. Someone who owned dozens of guns, who had voted for Donald Trump, now called a gun control activist regularly, not to argue, but to listen to their views and get updates. Differences didn't disappear, but respect and friendship had formed. That's the essence of emotional conversation. It doesn't force us to abandon our views, but it forces us to see the person behind the viewpoint. When we recount memories that made us hurt or proud, we reveal a vulnerable part of ourselves. And paradoxically, it is this vulnerability that creates the strength of connection. Researchers call this emotional contagion. When we open up, others often respond. When we dare to say, "I'm scared," the other person tends to admit their own worries. And in that back and forth rhythm, a kind of neural synchronization occurs, bringing both closer. To open emotional conversations, it's not always necessary to directly ask, "How are you feeling?" Often, the best way is to ask a seemingly simple question that touches the core. What has changed you the most in the past year? Who are you most proud of? Or, is there a memory that always brings tears to your eyes? Such deep questions invite others to recount a part of their lives. And in that story, emotions naturally emerge. Another important thing, when others share, respond with a piece of yourself. Don't just nod and change the subject. Say, "I've experienced something similar," or "I've never experienced that, but hearing you tell it moves me." This response signals, "I'm truly listening, and I'm also letting you into my world." Once you've entered the emotional zone, the most important thing is to know how to listen. Listen not just with your ears, but with your entire presence. People may say very little, but their eyes, tone, and pauses contain more than words. If we only wait for our turn to speak, we'll miss the real message. Research shows that when someone shares something private, simply having the other person look into their eyes, nod gently, or repeat a few words to acknowledge it makes them feel much safer. These small responses make the other person believe, "I am being heard." In an online environment, this is even more challenging. Screens obscure many body language cues, leading to misunderstandings. But groups that maintain emotional connections still have one thing in common: they create small rules to affirm presence. They type, "I understand," into the chat. They use emojis. They repeat an important phrase the other person just said. These small details replace the real-life nod and help the conversation maintain its warmth. An impressive example is the gun conversation. When the remaining members began to share personal stories, they weren't just talking politics. They spoke of lost loved ones, of fear in the dead of night, of the pride of protecting their families. And the listeners, instead of refuting, listened. Someone typed, "I don't agree with your policy, but I hear your pain." A simple sentence, but it created recognition, something political slogans never provide. Emotion is not just a secondary factor in communication, it is the central core. Emotional conversations create neural synchronization, like an orchestra harmonizing. Heart rates, breathing, and even brain activity can synchronize when two people share honestly. That's not a metaphor, but a biological reality. This explains why deep questions are so effective. When we ask about childhood memories, about beliefs that have formed, the other person's brain activates regions of memory and emotion. They don't just recall, they relive the feeling of that moment, and in the process of telling, that emotion spreads to us, synchronizing both. Of course, it's not always easy. Sometimes the other person is closed off, or we ourselves feel uncomfortable. But the key is honesty. Just saying, "I'm not sure I'm saying this right, but I want to understand you better," is enough to open a crack. That very awkwardness makes the conversation real. The strange thing about emotional conversations is that they make us feel both fragile and stronger. The moment we dare to say, "I miss my mother terribly," or "I once felt so alone I didn't want to go on," we open a door that previously seemed impassable, and almost always, the person opposite us will step through with us. In the study of hedge fund managers, they initially rejected the idea of asking about the last time they cried. But when one person dared to answer, the atmosphere changed. The others felt they too were allowed to be honest. Honesty spreads faster than any fact, and thanks to that, two people who were once strangers now left feeling familiar. That's also why those who participated in the gun conversation group, originally at two political extremes, could become friends. They didn't change their views, but they began to see each other as real people, not just symbols. And when that happened, they could call each other monthly just to ask, "How are you today?" The practical advice from all these experiences is very clear. Bring emotions to the surface instead of ignoring them. Ask deep questions instead of just superficial ones. Listen to unspoken language. Asterisk the hesitation, the wandering gaze, because often that is the real content. Respond with a piece of your own life. The best way to open an emotional conversation is to acknowledge the awkwardness. "I'm not sure I should ask this, but I really want to understand you better." Just one sentence like that is enough to create a safe space. Sometimes, awkwardness is proof of sincerity. Deep down, all of us long to be heard, to be seen, to be felt as whole human beings. When we dare to step into an emotional conversation, we give others that gift. And paradoxically, when we give, we also receive closeness, connection, and irreplaceable memory. That is the power of the second type of conversation. It's not about solving problems, nor about defining identity. It's simply to remind us that behind all logic and opinions, we are still human beings with emotions that need to be shared. From here, the journey leads us to the final type of conversation, conversations about social identity, where the question is no longer, "What are we talking about?" or "How are we feeling?" but "Who are we in this relationship and in the wider world?" Part 4, Who are we? There's a type of conversation that most people avoid, yet it's everywhere, conversations about identity. These are the moments when the question is no longer, "What are we talking about?" or "How are we feeling?" but "Who are we?" When identity is placed at the center, every word carries an unusual weight. An unintentional remark can turn into a wound because it doesn't just touch an opinion, but deeply touches the core of a person. Think of arguments about race, gender, religion, politics, or anything tied to collective identity. These are the most explosive conversations because every word can be heard as a denial of someone's being. But paradoxically, if we dare to enter this territory with skill, this is also where relationships become most profound. A clear example comes from a fiercely debated topic, vaccination. For years, scientists and doctors tried to persuade parents who opposed vaccines with reams of medical data. They presented charts, research, and evidence. The result was often only more fierce resistance. Those parents didn't hear numbers, they only heard one thing: "You are ignorant people who don't know how to protect your children." And when they felt their identity attacked, all arguments became meaningless. Then some research groups decided on a different approach. They started not with facts, but with acknowledging identity. "Parents want to do what's best for their children," they said. "I understand you're worried. Because I'm also a parent, I also want to protect my children from all risks." When identity is acknowledged instead of denied, the door opens. The parents began to listen, and when they felt safe, they were willing to look at the scientific data. That's the crux. Conversations about identity cannot begin with logic, they must begin with acknowledgement. When we tell someone, "I see you as a devoted father," or "I know you are someone who always puts family first," we offer them a positive mirror to see themselves in. And when they feel their identity is respected, they are ready to hear difficult truths. This can be applied to countless other situations. A colleague from an ethnic minority group, a gay friend, a newly immigrated employee. When they share their experiences, if we only respond with facts or analysis, they will hear denial. But if we acknowledge their identity, we open up space for deeper conversation. In an increasingly diverse society, this type of conversation becomes unavoidable. And precisely because it is the most vulnerable, it also demands the most from us: sensitivity, patience, and courage. In the corporate environment, conversations about identity often erupt when least expected. Netflix is a prime example. In an internal meeting, Fred, the head of communications, repeated a racial slur while discussing how the company should handle sensitive language. He didn't use the word to offend, but the act of repeating it made many employees, especially people of color, feel their identity was being disregarded. Within days, the situation escalated. Furious emails were sent. Many employees said they no longer felt safe working with this leader. Netflix faced a difficult decision: keep a talented senior executive or protect the trust of the workforce. Fred was fired. This event was shocking not just because someone lost their job, but because it exposed the fragility of conversations about identity. Just one misplaced word can be heard as a complete denial of an entire community. And in that context, no one cares about the original intention. What matters is the listener's perception. After the incident, Netflix didn't just replace the person. The company began to implement new training, teaching employees how to engage in these difficult conversations. They encouraged everyone to ask questions, but also emphasized the right to refuse to answer. This is because many minority employees were accustomed to bearing the burden of explaining themselves. Sometimes they want to share, but sometimes they just want to be left alone. The lesson is that safety doesn't come from forcing others to speak, but from allowing them to choose. Only when they know they can refuse will they feel comfortable opening up. From these experiences, a set of principles can be derived. Before the conversation, ask yourself, what is my goal? What obstacles might arise: anger, silence, or withdrawal? And if that happens, how will I stay calm? When starting, set the groundwork. I know this is a difficult topic. I don't expect you to share if you're not ready, but I want to understand more if you feel comfortable. Such an opening acknowledges the difficulty while affirming the listener's freedom. During the conversation, the most important thing is to listen on a deep level. Don't just react to the words, but recognize the underlying identity message. An employee says, "I never feel respected in meetings." You're not just complaining about procedure, but expressing, "My identity is being devalued." If we only address the technical problem, we miss the core issue. And when ending, reiterate why this conversation is important. Not just to resolve conflict, but to affirm that everyone has a place, that each individual's identity is respected within the collective. When identity enters the dialogue, we often face simmering tension. The speaker fears being judged. The listener fears accidentally offending. This tension leads many to choose avoidance. But avoidance doesn't make the problem disappear. It only accumulates and waits to explode. The only way through is to build a safe space. That space doesn't come naturally. It's created through preparation and clear signals during the dialogue. Some researchers call this groundwork. Meaning, before starting, we need to clarify the purpose. Do we want to learn, listen, or change? If it's simply to vent anger or prove oneself right, the conversation will quickly fall apart. But if there's a genuine desire to understand, then no matter how difficult, there's a chance to find common ground. When entering, immediately acknowledge the difficulty. I know this is a sensitive topic, and I might say something wrong, but I want to learn, and I'll be grateful if you give me the chance. Such words are like placing a cushion under both parties' feet. If you fall, at least it won't hurt too much. During the conversation, sometimes the important thing isn't to argue, but to be silent, to allow the other person to pause, breathe, or refuse to answer. That moment isn't a failure, but proof of safety. They know they have control over the conversation. Many multinational companies now apply this principle in diversity and inclusion training sessions. Instructors often say from the outset, if there's a question that makes you uncomfortable, you don't have to answer. This right to refuse doesn't weaken the conversation. On the contrary, it makes voluntary sharing stronger and more trustworthy. Another subtle point: in conversations about identity, often the listener reacts not to the words but to underlying emotions. An unintentional gesture, an ill-considered word, can be understood as a denial. Therefore, skilled communicators often pay attention not only to content but also to context. Who is speaking? To whom? In what situation? For example, when a woman says she feels interrupted in meetings, what she wants to hear isn't, "I'll let you finish your thought next time," but "I'm sorry I made you feel your voice wasn't respected." The difference is that one addresses behavior, while the other acknowledges identity. Identity always demands recognition. When we see and name it, we help the other person feel safe to continue, and once safety is established, even difficult conversations become opportunities for connection. One of the biggest challenges in identity conversations is defensiveness. When identity feels threatened, people immediately erect barriers. They might become angry, counterattack, or retreat into silence. To keep the dialogue going, we need to learn to recognize and de-escalate this defensive reaction. An important technique is to asterisk separate intent from impact. Often, we don't mean to offend, but our words still cause hurt. Our first reaction is usually to explain, "I didn't mean it that way." But that explanation inadvertently denies the listener's experience, making them hurt even more. Instead, a better approach is to acknowledge the impact. "I understand that what I said hurt you, and I'm sorry for that." That acknowledgement paves the way for healing. This is what Netflix had to learn after the incident with Fred. The leadership understood that they couldn't just say, "He didn't mean any harm." The important thing was to listen to the employees who were affected, acknowledge that they felt offended, and take action to affirm their value in the organization. Only then could trust be rebuilt. Another tool is to ask questions instead of arguing. If someone says, "I always feel excluded," it's easy to react, "No, that's not true, we still value you." But that only makes the other person feel unheard. Instead, ask, "Can you tell me a specific situation that made you feel that way?" The question opens an opportunity for the other person to tell their story, and from there, both can understand more clearly. Science also supports this. Research in social psychology shows that when people tell stories tied to their identity, they are not just conveying information but also asserting, "Who I am." If others listen and acknowledge, they feel their identity is reinforced instead of threatened, and in that state, they are more likely to participate in dialogue. Safety and identity conversations also comes from setting clear boundaries. Sometimes the wisest thing is to stop. "I think we should take a break. I need some time to think." Allowing a pause doesn't mean failure, but respect for both parties' limits. These limits prevent the conversation from devolving into a destructive conflict. In the long run, organizations or families that learn to have identity conversations will be more resilient because they can confront the deepest disagreements without falling apart. They know how to affirm the value of each individual, even when disagreements cannot be resolved immediately. Looking back at the whole, we see that identity conversations are not only the most difficult but also the most potentially rich. There, people don't argue about data or plans but expose their core. Who am I? Where do I belong? Am I respected? And precisely because of this, any word carries multiplied weight. To step into that fragile zone requires careful preparation. Before speaking, think about your goal, about possible reactions, and about how to stay calm when the situation becomes tense. When starting, establish a safe foundation. Acknowledge the difficulty, allow refusal, and invite sharing. During the conversation, pay attention not only to the words but also to the underlying identity message. And when ending, reiterate why this dialogue is important, because it affirms that everyone has value, everyone is seen. In the stories about vaccines, we saw that only by acknowledging their identity as parents were people willing to listen to science. In the Netflix story, we saw that just one word could shatter trust if identity was denied. And in countless other situations, from corporate boardrooms to family dinner tables, that principle always holds true. Identity needs to be respected for dialogue to have a place. Supercommunicators understand that there's no way to perpetually avoid this type of conversation. Sooner or later, every group, every community, every relationship must confront the question, who are we? And when that moment comes, success lies not in persuading others to change, but in creating a safe space for everyone to be honest. The deepest connections arise not from where we agree, but from the ability to stand together in disagreement while still respecting each other. When we can listen to others talk about their identity, and when we also dare to reveal ourselves, the relationship not only becomes more durable, but also becomes a source of collective strength. That is the key message. Identity conversation is where we are most vulnerable, but also where connection is strongest. It is the ultimate test of communication ability. And when we pass it, we not only understand others better, but also redefine ourselves in this world. From here, the journey will move to the final part. How connection is formed, maintained, and spread, where all the previous principles converge to create the art of communication at its highest level.